Hello, anatomy. Let's talk about my very favorite of all the systems, the endocrine system. So unlike all of the other systems we have talked about or will talk about, sorry, the endocrine system looks like a random assortment of organs that just don't even connect. And this is one of many of my very favorite anatomical models where it shows both male and female sex characteristics, which, while very, very uncommon, does happen sometimes, but this is just kind of showing that the endocrine system overlaps in the males and females in many, many ways, but also we see a difference between males. There's a lot of different things going on with the sexes we'll talk about later, but in a stereotypical female, we have the uterus and the ovaries that are endocrine glands, while in males we have the testes. Everything else, though, is from the pancreas up is shared between both sexes. Okay, so what's up with the endocrine system? Why is it my favorite? Why did I dedicate so many years of my life to the endocrine system? And why do I love to talk about it so much? The endocrine system is fantastic. Let's make this a little bigger. Okay, so what's going on here? The endocrine system is interesting in that it controls the body using hormones. So the chemical signal in the endocrine system are the hormones. And the whole point of the endocrine system is to maintain homeostasis, specifically areas of metabolism, stress, and reproduction. So you may have seen, we talked a little bit about the neurosystem in the nervous system, that the parasympathetic system is all about, which is your rest and digest system, is all about maintaining homeostasis. The somatic nervous system is about getting you away from a danger in order to get you back to homeostasis. So homeostasis is very important. It is how your body just maintains normal levels of everything, just life in general. And while the nervous system, we're going to compare the endocrine and the nervous system together because they both do the same thing, but in different ways. So the chemical messenger of the endocrine system is the hormone. These are carried through the body via the blood. So the one thing that really ties the endocrine system together is that all of these glands release something into the blood system. They don't do it through a duct. They don't do it through a neuron, none of those things. It just goes straight into the blood and then has to be carried to wherever its target cells are just by hitting it randomly in the blood, which seems kind of very weird and not very accurate, but it works. It doesn't not work. Evolution's all about it. So what you see in the system as a kind of the generic way we think of the system, you have some cell that secretes it, or some gland full of cells that's secreting this hormone, this little blue thing. It goes into the blood cell, and it's going to hit almost every single cell in the body, in theory. But if the cell does not have the receptor, it's not going to react. Okay, so it has to hit a cell that has the receptor specific to that hormone. And this is interesting because a lot of times this actually works a little bit backwards, and that our cells always have the receptors for estrogen and testosterone. It's just the presence or absence of estrogen and testosterone that makes us exhibit male and female characteristics. And we'll go into this a lot in the reproductive section, but you see a lot of times people who like bodybuild. We talked a little bit about how you can in the skin, you secrete different chemicals out through your sweat and through your sebaceous glands, those oil glands. One of those things you can't secrete are pheromones, or the hormones that are involved in sexual activity and sexual just maturity. And so a lot of times bodybuilders that are taking a whole lot of steroids, either testosterone or something like testosterone that is anabolic, which builds them up, they'll secrete that in their sweat, and then if they go and they hug a child, and if they're doing this over and over, well, they're now very testosterone-rich sweat is getting absorbed by this kid who hasn't gone through puberty yet. But they have the receptors so that when puberty happens, they'll be ready to take up that testosterone. So you see cases where bodybuilder kids, the kids of bodybuilders, go through puberty when they're like 8, which is not good for you. You end up, those people, remember we talked about in the bones, when you hit puberty, you see a release of estrogen. Even in males, you have this big spike in testosterone, which leads to a spike in estrogen, which stops bone growth. So people who go through puberty early are not as tall as people who do it later. And so if you're getting that extra dose of testosterone before you hit puberty, a lot of weird stuff starts happening. Same thing happens in females. If a prepubescent female is exposed to estrogen somehow, the receptors are there, so once that estrogen is in the system in a high level, they go through puberty also. amazing and complicated and a very strange and beautiful system. We're going to get into it a lot. So, but the big point is that the target cells with receptors for the specific hormones receive the signal. So you can bathe this cell in the hormone forever, but the fact that it doesn't have the receptor means that it's not going to react, in a very, very oversimplified way to think about it. And this idea of the ductless glands does not mean that they don't have ducts, as in the animal, but they don't have a, the hormone has to be kind of leaked out of the organ itself. And the way that this was discovered, so for a long time, people have known that the testes cause animals to go through puberty, okay? So if you want to have a more docile animal that doesn't get really aggressive, you castrate it. And so some guy figured he was castrating goats, and he said, well, what if I take this testis that I took out of one goat and I just sew it into the chest of another goat? Because that's how science worked for a while, was just, let's see what happens. We don't need any ethics. And so they did that, and what they noticed is they took this, a goat that had been castrated before puberty, they took an active testis from a goat that had already reached puberty and was very sexually mature. They took that sexually mature testis, put it in the goat who had never experienced any sexual maturity because his testes were taken out way before puberty, and then all of a sudden that goat that got the testis from another goat started hitting puberty, even though all they did was just sew up that testis somewhere in the chest. It wasn't connected to anything. It was just doing something, leaking something that was then absorbed by the bloodstream, which then caused all these actions. So in theory, you can take an endocrine gland and put it anywhere in the body, and it's still going to have the same function, because all it does is just leak hormones that then get absorbed by the bloodstream and then taken all around the body. Some cells are much more reactive or sensitive to hormones than others, and it's all about how many receptors are present. We could go into this for hours and hours, but I will relieve you of that and move on. Okay, so bodily secretions. We talk a lot about bodily secretions in anatomy, as we should. If something is an exocrine secretion, it's secreted from a gland into a duct. Okay, so we talked about sweat already. If you are releasing bile, then that is being released from the gallbladder into the intestine directly through a duct. So it has this tube that connects one thing to another. So that is considered an exocrine secretion. Endocrine means it's secreted completely ductless. It just leaks into this bloodstream. Okay, so exocrine happens really directly. Okay, it's like our sweat gets released from the sweat gland directly out onto the skin where it has its action. It cools us down. Done. The endocrine can be secreted from anywhere. It goes into the bloodstream and then gets picked up all over the body, wherever the receptors are. There's two more we don't really talk about a lot, but paracrine is secreted from one cell to act on its neighboring cell, and then autocrine is secreted from a cell, and then it comes back and acts on itself to either ramp up the signal or turn it down. And this, we usually just talk about this in terms of positive and negative feedback, which we'll get into more later. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about temperature regulation, in that if you are really hot, you start sweating, that makes your temperature go down, and then you have a negative feedback loop that says, well, I'm already cool enough, I'm going to turn this system off. So that's a negative feedback loop. It's a system that turns on and then ends up turning itself off. A positive feedback loop, on the other hand, would be an autocrine system where you, so a different kind of autocrine system where you have a signal that amplifies itself. So like during pregnancy, you release oxytocin in order to, well, during birth, so during parturition, you release oxytocin, which is one of the hormones that makes the uterus contract, and that causes the baby to be expelled, or born is a less clinical term. Well, when those contractions are happening, you want them to keep happening. You don't want that system to turn itself off. You want it to happen until the baby is gone. It's out of the body. So oxytocin then goes to the brain and amplifies its own signal, because it says, oh, we're releasing oxytocin. We better release some more oxytocin and some more prostaglandins and all these other things that will make the system amplify until the final act happens. So an autocrine could be involved in, an autocrine hormone could be, or autocrine chemical, sorry, could be involved in a negative feedback or a positive feedback loop. Okay, moving on. So it's interesting to think about the endocrine versus the nervous systems together. Okay, so the nervous system involves neurotransmitters. So the ultimate release of the nervous system, so we have this action potential where you have this electrical signal zapping down the neuron, and it releases neurotransmitters, and that acts directly on the very next neuron. So that's a nice example of something that's paracrine. Okay, So a paracrine cell acts on an immediately neighboring cell. Okay, so it acts on one neuron to the next one. The endocrine system releases hormones into the blood, and it just has to hopefully get to where it's going in a meaningful amount of time. It turns out it works just fine. It also, okay, we'll keep going. So where does this act? So the nervous system acts on only one other place, so whatever its neighbor is. So it could be acting on another neuron that's postsynaptic. It could be acting on a muscle, if we're talking about the neuromuscular junction, or it could be acting on some gland or organ like the heart to make it do a thing, like make the heart start beating faster during a stress response. On the other hand, the endocrine system can hit any cell in the body that has a receptor. So the fact that the bloodstream is now filled with whatever hormone that has been activated or has been released means that blood is then going to go and bathe the whole body. It's going to go through the whole body. So the whole body, any place that has that receptor, is going to start being activated by it. So an interesting example of this is insulin. So insulin is the hormone that makes your cells take up sugar. So if you have too high of a blood sugar and you don't have diabetes, you your system is like, oh, we just ate a whole lot of food. We need to make sure that there's not just a bunch of random sugar in the bloodstream because that could cause bad things to happen when they shouldn't. We need to regulate this. So insulin gets released from the pancreas. It goes into the bloodstream, and then it hits everything in the body with the receptor. It hits everything in the body. And the cells with the receptors, those insulin receptors, will say, oh, hey, insulin's here. It's telling us to take up as much sugar as we can from the blood system so that we can recycle it, or we can use it later. So that is definitely a slower system. It takes a while for it to turn on and a while for it to turn off. Well, neurons are automatically on, automatically off if they hit the right threshold, right? So neurons can be hit repetitively, so on. You have to go through that system of going through the action potential and then the refractory period, whereas an endocrine system tends to be very cyclical. So the one of the most recent Nobel Prizes in physiology or medicine looked at our circadian rhythms, and our circadian rhythm is the cycle that our brain deals with on a daily basis, and it's based on how much light you take in every day, and that light affects a hormone called melanin, not melatonin. That's what makes the color in our pigmentation in our skin and our eyes, but melanin is a hormone that is turned off. In humans, it's turned off. In any animal that's active during the day, it's turned off during light cycles. Okay, so like during the day for humans, if you have a late night job, you're getting and you're exposed to light late at night, you're getting a mixed signal basically. And then in darkness, that hormone's turned on, and it says, hey, it's dark, it's time to sleep. I'm going to turn myself on. I'm going to go and make sure everything that you're supposed to do when you're sleeping is happening. And that's part of your circadian rhythm. On the other hand, in nocturnal animals, it's light that turns on melanin, and it says, hey, it's time to go to sleep. We sleep during the day. So any light, or a certain amount of light is going to release melanin. It's time to go to sleep. It's time to do growth and other kind of things that happen during sleep. So you see this cyclical pattern of hormones, okay? Whereas you usually can't just get a hormone to start acting really fast. You have to go through a whole bunch of cycles first. Whereas in the nervous system, as long as you have enough signal, it'll turn on and off as much as you want it to. Well, as the body wants it to. If you're a Star Trek nerd like I am, the interesting way I think about this is the endocrine system is kind of the all hands on deck, like red alert. So everyone in the ship is like, oh no, something's happening. I guess you could think about this military wise too. So the entire ship is on red alert, and it's like paying attention to that alarm, and then the people are supposed to do stuff. No, they're supposed to do stuff. Whereas the nervous system is like the captain giving very specific orders. So, and it's making people do things that are going to have very specific actions based on what they're listening to from this captain or the nervous system. Whereas the endocrine system, again, is kind of the system-wide alert or activation or deactivation, depending on what that hormone is doing. Okay, so let's talk about, this is another one of my very favorite pictures because I feel like she's just like, hey, I'm on the endocrine system, and he's totally judging her. What is he even looking at? Yep, that's right. He's being one of those guys. Who drew this? I don't even know. Okay, so let's talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system has, there are new endocrine glands being discovered all the time. A couple years ago in the news, I don't even know which news, it was said that a new organ has been found, and it's an endocrine organ in the gut called the mesentery. Know that we know in this class that the mesentery is just a lining of the abdominal cavity. Well, it turns out it also secretes a hormone. So almost everything in the body can secrete a hormone, which then goes and does something in another place. And so we have glands that are specifically endocrine, and they don't do anything else, like the pineal gland, which is up here in the brain, and that's what secretes that melanin that I was talking about. The pituitary gland exists underneath the hypothalamus, which also does other things. We talked about that in the brain section. The adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, and they deal with stress and water retention and salt balance. The thyroid gland hangs out here, okay, and then the parathyroid gland are these little dots that hang out on top of the thyroid gland. We've talked, these two should sound familiar because we talked about the thyroid and the parathyroid when we talked about calcium regulation in the bones, okay. So then we have so many glands that are involved. They have an endocrine function, but it was definitely not the first thing that was discovered about them. But now people are realizing, oh, except maybe in the testis, well, even in the testis case, that wasn't the first thing people discovered. But they definitely have an important endocrine role as well. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It's kind of this master organ that tells every other endocrine gland what to do and when to do it based on all the sensory information it takes in. The pancreas here, is going to be, this is involved, it produces bile, but it also produces insulin and glucagon, which are hormones, and bile is just part of the digestive system. The thymus is, where are you, thymus? The thymus is, it's basically pointing at nothing. And so what's happening there is the thymus basically decreases to almost nothing after, oh wait, it's pointing up here. Okay, so these are the adrenals. So the thymus, these are actually much bigger than they are in real life. When you're adults, they kind of have gone away completely. There's some tissue left over, but mostly these are important in prenatal development of our immune system, but they do secrete some hormones also. We know that the ovaries and the testis are involved in sexual reproduction and sexual maturity, but it's also weird because our heart and our kidneys, which we know, which aren't even on this diagram because it's that old. So our kidneys do a lot of hormone regulation, and then so does our heart, and it has to do with blood pressure. And so our lungs actually, I think last time I read, the lungs also release a hormone, or at least very, very receptive to hormones, to help in blood pressure and oxygen content regulation. It's very complicated. Do I need you to memorize all of these things? Oh my god, no. I took a whole class in college just to memorize these things. You're just learning it in one lecture in anatomy. Just know that there are many glands. Any gland that secretes a chemical messenger into the blood is considered an endocrine gland. So that's kind of the key. Any gland that secretes a chemical messenger directly into the bloodstream is an endocrine gland. And we have some that are exclusively endocrine and some that also have other functions. Okay, so there's two big types of hormones. Very important to know. The ones, usually when people talk about hormones, they're thinking about steroids. Often they're thinking about steroids. Steroids are these chemicals that are made from cholesterol, which means they're made from a fat or a lipid, and so they are hydrophobic. They do not dissolve in water. It's like when you have oil in water, it's the oil part. Because they're hydrophobic, they can pass through cell membranes really easily, which is how they pass through our skin really easily as well. And what they have to do, for the most part, is they enter the cell and then they attach a receptor that goes and affects the DNA directly. And what that does is it changes transcription. So it changes what RNA is being made from the DNA, so what long-term signal is being activated in the cells, okay? So these are things like estrogen and testosterone, which are what people think about when they think about steroids. Progesterone is another primarily female, but actually important male also hormone that's involved in sexual reproduction and about a million other things. Cortisol is our stress hormone, and so this is whenever I love the stress system, it's so ridiculous. The first hormone that's released during stress is epinephrine or adrenaline, and it's also I guess it's a neurotransmitter, but it's not a steroid, and so that it has really fast action to kind of get you out of a stressful situation. Well, if you're still in that stressful situation after 5 minutes, your body switches on cortisol. And so cortisol is kind of this, well, we can't get out of this bad situation, so how can we deal with it to make sure we survive? And so that's cortisol's role. It changes your blood pressure, it changes your digestive system, it changes a lot of different things to try and get you out of a bad, stressful situation, even those that we make with our own brains, because humans are ridiculous. So aldosterone is a hormone, it's another steroid. It's involved in regulating salt balance. And so aldosterone, we'll talk about it again when we talk about the kidneys, but what it does is it causes you to retain salt, and when you retain salt, you retain water. So if you have high blood pressure, you may have some problems with your aldosterone. All right, on top of everything else. Okay, so the other kind of hormones are the non-steroidal hormones. They tend to be amino acids or proteins. There are actually some that are gases, but we're not going to talk a lot about it. These are your most common kinds of hormones. These have really fast action, so it takes about 30 minutes to see the action of a steroidal hormone happen. But these can happen within 5 minutes, okay? So even though cortisol is activated in 5 minutes, it doesn't start to actually show an effect for 30 minutes because it's a steroid. But the protein hormones can start acting in between 1 and 5 minutes on whatever their target cell is. Okay, so they don't get past the cell membrane because they're proteins, and they're big molecules, and they're also hydrophilic mostly, so they just kind of, they bounce off of this structure, so if they don't hit the receptor, they just bounce off. So if they do hit the receptor, that causes stuff to happen inside the cell. So don't worry about what all these steps are. Just know that the protein hormones activate a receptor, which then causes this cascade of actions, which then causes some difference, okay? So for example, epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline, that is the hormone. That's your immediate fight or flight hormone, your stress hormone that says, "Oh my God, do something." So you need that to happen immediately when you see a stress response. So if someone's coming at you with, serial killer coming at you with a knife, you don't want to sit and wait to see what your body's going to do in 30 minutes, which is what happens with a stress hormone. You want to get the frick out of there before you get stabbed by that serial killer, okay? And so these things happen incredibly quickly. This is that giant feat of strength where moms can lift cars off of children. This is that crazy action to get stuff happening. That's what adrenaline is doing, or epinephrine is another name for it. There are so many different kinds of hormones that fall in this category, though. We definitely do not have time to go into all of them. But the ones we've talked about, the calcitonin and the parathyroid hormone, those are both hormones that are non-steroidal. So those are both protein hormones, and they act pretty quickly. Okay, let's keep on. So how do you even regulate these things if they have such big effects and they're slow to turn on and they're slow to turn off and they have to be cyclical? Well, you have to have some sort of stimulus, and we're going to talk about 3 different kinds. So you have these fluid stimuli. So this is going to be any kind of fluid response. We'll talk about what that means. So this could be just we'll talk about it. There's neuronal response or neural responses. So this has to do with the nerves, okay? This via the fluids, like the blood, that's what humoral means. Humoral just means fluids, like blood. And then the most common thing you see is this releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These are the control center hormones. Control! And these, we'll talk about it. They get into basically taking in information from a system and then changing your body to do something slightly different as a result. Okay, so we talked a bit about these negative feedback things. So in the case of, let's go in order. So the humoral control, this is an example of this is the regulation of blood glucose. So humoral control means anytime the blood is kind of sending signals around and then stuff makes a response happen as a result. Okay, so we talked a little bit about insulin a little bit. So let's say you're the pancreas and you're being bathed by all the blood. It's kind of going through the body, just all the blood is circulating, and it happens to go through the pancreas. And then the pancreas detects that blood glucose is a little bit high because you just ate a big old hamburger and you have all this sugar coming in. Let's say you ate a whole bunch of cake, and now you have all the sugar in your bloodstream, and insulin's like, oh my God, if I have sugar in my bloodstream, I really need to pack it away, because what if I don't eat again for like 10 days? And so your body's really good about storing those carbohydrates for later. Remember, if it's been 24 hours, you stop storing those as carbohydrates, and you store them as lipids, so you store them as fat. Okay, so insulin's like, oh my God, we have all this sugar, we need to make sure that we maintain this 90 milligrams of glucose in 100 milliliters of blood. Don't worry about those numbers, but it's basically got this set point where it says, I have to make sure if I have too much, I'm going to release insulin. And so if I release insulin, then, what are these things supposed to be? Oh, this is the liver. I don't know what this is. This is the pancreas. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be. I guess it's, maybe it's, anyway. The pancreas says, oh no, the blood sugar's too high. I'm going to release insulin. So then insulin goes and it causes the cells to suck up all of that glucose that's hanging out in the bloodstream. Okay, let's say it's been a long time since you've been eating, and all of a sudden your blood glucose drops below this, okay? Well, then that blood keeps traveling through the system, and it's really low, and then your pancreas says, oh no, we need to go and pull all of that stored glucose out. Oh, this is a liver. There's a reason this is a liver. And so the pancreas has stored a whole lot of that glucose in the liver as something, well, as this complex sugar. And so in order to get it out of there, we have to release the hormone glucagon. And I remember that because I say all the glucose is gone, I need some more. So glucagon must be what puts more sugar back into your bloodstream. It releases sugar into the bloodstream. So when when glucose is really low, when your blood sugar is really low, you release glucagon because the blood that goes by the pancreas gets detected by the pancreas, and the pancreas says, oh no, the level's too low, release glucagon! And it goes to the liver and causes sugar to be released. If glucose is really high, you release insulin, so the blood going through the pancreas has too much glucose in it, so the pancreas releases insulin, and then that causes the liver to start storing glucose, and it causes your cells to pick up a bunch of extra glucose. So see how it goes both ways? Okay, so if it's too much, you release insulin. If it's too little, you release glucagon. But the brain is not involved in this at all. It's all just the blood hitting an organ and then causing a difference. So that is it's an example of a humoral response. What else is happening? So this is just kind of looking at it in more detail. This is the small intestines. So you have a bunch of blood vessels going through the pancreas. That's where the insulin and the glucagon are released. While the other thing the pancreas does, it creates bile. It releases that bile into these ducts, which then release directly into the small intestine, which those are not endocrine. That's not an endocrine release because it's released into a duct, which then goes directly into something. On the other hand, let's see, the hormones get released directly into the bloodstream. Okay, yeah, we already talked about this. Let's keep going. So what if you don't make insulin? Or what if your body doesn't respond to insulin? Either of those cases, that is insulin deficiency or diabetes, okay? So type 1 diabetes is where you just never made enough insulin or you don't have the right receptor, so this is something you're born with. And type 2 diabetes is where you usually this happens in people in cases of obesity, where your fat cells get so big from storing all that amazing extra energy that you've given your body, but then they don't have enough receptors to be activated by the insulin in the bloodstream, so they just don't ever get activated. And so that's a problem because your cells don't make extra receptors in that case. So what you see is this abnormal increase in blood glucose. And then, so people who, like in field medics and like the Civil War and other wars like that, where before any really good combat medics were trained in like advanced medical technologies, they would test to see if someone had diabetes if they were brought in from the field unconscious by tasting their urine. So that if you have very sweet urine, it means you have unusually high levels of sugar in your bloodstream because your body's not regulating it. And you might say, why does that matter? Why does it matter if we have a lot of sugar in our bloodstream? Well, sugar is a very active, high-energy molecule. If you don't have enough insulin, your glucose goes up, okay? Then you're filtering all this in your kidneys, and it starts to kind of beat up your kidneys, okay? So you pee some of it out, but as you're doing that, you now have, if you have very sweet pee, you're going to have to start releasing a whole lot of water to balance it, and then your blood volume goes down a lot because you're peeing so much. That means that you have very, very low blood sugar, or very, very low blood pressure, which means your blood isn't getting enough, your brain isn't getting enough blood, and neither are your organs, and you can go into a coma, you can get brain damage, and you can even die from not getting enough blood circulating to the rest of your body. So it's actually an incredibly dangerous thing to have happen, and that's why people with diabetes have to monitor their blood sugar all the time. Okay. So that's all we're going to say about diabetes. It's very important to regulate with insulin. Okay. So here's another humoral example, the parathyroid gland, which we've talked about in calcium regulation. So if this is our larynx, so in the case of the, so males get a very enlarged larynx actually because it is responding to testosterone. So the larynx within, so this is cartilage, but on the inside you have your vocal cords, which are muscles, and muscles get bigger with response to testosterone. So when males are going through puberty, when everyone's going through puberty, males release a whole lot of testosterone that causes the muscles in the larynx to get really big, and that's why boys or guys have deeper voices. And why they have Adam's apple, because those larger muscles push the larynx out a bit so it becomes more obvious. So that's an example of a response to hormones, is the larynx bulging out. But just underneath the larynx is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is this weird people say it looks like a butterfly. It looks like, I don't know, but that's no butterfly I've ever seen. But it's a squishy looking gland that exists in front of, just below the larynx. It also, depending on where they develop, has these 4 little tiny glands called the parathyroids. They could be in the front, they could be in the back. It doesn't matter because they aren't releasing into a duct. All they do is release into a bloodstream. So as long as they're organized in these 4 little things somewhere, they're active. So these are the parathyroids. The parathyroids release the very interestingly named parathyroid hormone, which then causes your osteoclasts, which are the bone-breaking cells, to break down some bone tissue to release calcium into the bloodstream. So this is, again, another example of blood coming through a system. The system says, the signal's kind of weak. I need to increase it. I'm going to then send that hormone to go and cause that signal to be increased. So there's another humoral response. The thyroid gland does the same thing. So the thyroid gland, if it gets a signal saying there's way too much calcium in the blood from all these blood vessels, then it releases thyroid hormone, or no, not thyroid hormone, calcitonin, which then goes and causes the bones to be built up more. So it causes the osteoblasts to be activated, and then that causes calcium to come out of the blood because it's being deposited in the bones. The thyroid also releases the thyroid hormones T3 and T4, which is it should be in your regular blood workups when you're doing doctor's appointments. Those regulate metabolism and can get really weird as we get older, so it's a good thing to monitor. Okay, so what about neural? So that was all humoral. So that is blood vessel stuff. But what about neural control? So how does the sympathetic nervous system cause us to, so that's your fight or flight system, what does that do? How do the nerves affect our hormones to make us do something? So we take in some signal that is stressful, like a lion is charging us, or we suddenly forgot that we have a lab practical this weekend, and we realize, oh my God, something's happening. It doesn't matter to your brain or to your sympathetic nervous system if it's something that will literally kill you or just something that freaks you out for whatever reason. You get the same response, and that is the release of norepinephrine because the neurons hit the adrenal gland, the outer part of the adrenal gland, the cortex, and it causes epinephrine to be released. So that's a nerve response causing the release of hormones. Now that epinephrine goes into the blood system and goes all over the body to make a whole bunch of different things happen. Okay, so you're suddenly faced with a bear. What do? You want to be more alert, so you're much more aware of what's happening around you. You're not daydreaming about whatever. Your body wants to make sure you have enough oxygen, so it increases the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the dilation of your bronchioles, so the tubes inside of your lungs, so that you can take in more air. Okay, it will also, depending on how long this response goes on, you will stimulate fat breakdown because all of a sudden you need energy so fast because what if you have to run away from this bear? Because you're dilating a bunch of things, and you have higher blood pressure and your heart rate has increased, you want to make sure you don't overheat, so you will start sweating. So the reason why you start sweating when you're nervous is because your body is like, things are happening and we're activating things really a lot, and we need to make sure we don't die of heat exhaustion. So you start sweating. Your pupils get bigger, your pupils dilate so that you can take in more light to assess the situation. You stop doing things that aren't important, like digestion. If you're about to be eaten by a bear, you do not need to digest that boiled egg you just ate. You need to get the frick out of that system out of this situation so you can survive to digest that egg later, okay? The same thing as, along the same lines, you also don't need to ovulate or make sperm cells if you're about to be eaten by a bear. Everything stops until you're out of that system, or away from that stressor, that stressful event. Overall, you have an increased metabolic rate, you see more oxygen getting used, and more heat being made because your body is trying to get you out of a bad situation. Again, your brain does not care if you're facing an actual bear or just scared of a horror movie. You're going to have the same responses. Now, what you do see, though, is that your the priming of your brain can affect what's happening here. So if you go into a horror movie and you know you're getting into it and you like horror movies, you're going to feel that same rush, but it's going to make you happy. Whereas if you go into a situation that's really terrifying, you're going to get the same rush and it's going to make you more alert in an unhappy way. So a lot of what we're going into when we go into a situation like this, what our brain is primed to do is going to affect how we react to it. Okay, so this is the same effect as that sympathetic nervous system stimulation, but hormones just make it last a lot longer to make sure you can get out of the situation more quickly. All right, so the last way that hormones can get activated that we talk about is the hypothalamic pituitary control, and so that is basically the brain controlling things. And so the difference is that in the case of the humoral responses and in the case of the neural responses, neither of these involve the brain very actively, but in the case of the HP axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, this is any kind of system where you have this interaction about the endocrine and the nervous systems, and they take in all this information they're getting in either from the body or from the environment or from other things, and they have to kind of sum up the signal and cause huge changes, okay? So this communicates with the anterior and the posterior pituitary, so that's right here, by two different mechanisms. So the anterior and posterior pituitary are half hormonal, half neural, okay? So the so people used to call this the master gland. That's actually not true. Old medical textbooks still call it that, but the hypothalamus actually controls the pituitary gland, so the hypothalamus is considered the master gland. It takes in all of the sensory information and then just has to decide which hormone needs to be released. So it sends like a simple releasing hormone to the pituitary, which then sends another releasing hormone to the rest of the body to make sure stuff happens. So the sella turcica should seem familiar. That's in your sphenoid. The posterior pituitary sits in this little indentation that basically is right above your soft palate. So if you feel with your tongue to where you have your hard palate directly at the top of your tongue, if you keep feeling to the back where it gets soft, your pituitary sits right above that. But there's bone in the way, so you can't actually touch it. So we only have the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary releases 6 hormones. So FSH, LH, blah, blah, blah. So someone told me you can remember this with the, it actually releases one more, with the anagram flag top. So flag would be FSH, LH, ACTH, GH. That's flag. And then T and prolactin. So flag, and then we just don't have an O, okay? All right, cool. So it's flag to P. Those are the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. Don't really care that you know that, well, I guess it should be important to know these. Really, you need to know that the posterior pituitary only releases 2 different hormones. That's it. They release ADH, which is involved in, that's antidiuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin. It's involved in making sure you retain enough water. And oxytocin, which is involved in so many different things. So oxytocin, we talked about earlier, is involved in parturition or birth. It's involved in milk production. It's involved in happy feelings. It's also involved in stalker feelings. It's a very, very complicated hormone. It does a lot of different things. But the posterior pituitary is the only one. It's one of 2 hormones released by the posterior pituitary. So then what happens? The posterior pituitary is different from the anterior because it's actually just an extension of the neurons that are in the hypothalamus. So really, ADH and oxytocin are made in the hypothalamus. They're just released from the posterior pituitary. So that's the important difference. The posterior pituitary is all neuronal tissue. The anterior pituitary, though, the neurons of the hypothalamus stop, and then they release into the blood that goes into the anterior pituitary, which causes the releasing hormones that this one makes to then be released. Okay, so there's a bit of a difference. The anterior pituitary is basically just like any other endocrine gland. The posterior pituitary is just the extension of the neurons from the hypothalamus. This just shows a picture, how they're very different. There's this idea that originally they were very separate, and then over time they've come together. I don't really want you to worry about that, though. Really what you need to know is that it's a very complicated system, okay? So the hypothalamus, let's say you are stressed out, okay? Or no, you're a growing individual. The hypothalamus says, hey, I've got enough nutrients, I'm taking in enough food, I'm in a very safe environment, I'm getting enough sleep, and so when it's time to sleep, I'm going to release GHRH, the growth hormone releasing hormone, and somatostatin. And those are going to go and they're going to affect the pituitary gland. And they're going to, this is the G basically, this is growth hormone. They're going to release, they cause the, so somatostatin says things are stressful, I don't have enough nutrients, we're going to actually stop the production of growth hormone. So GHRH says, no, everything's cool, we're going to make growth hormone happen. And if growth hormone is released from the pituitary, it enters the general bloodstream, and then it hits every part of our body where growth needs to happen, okay? So it hits the bone cells before puberty, it hits muscles basically anytime, and then it hits adipose tissue if we need to start storing more fat. Okay, so you see this idea where you have this kind of deciding factor here where it's like, do I have enough, whatever it is I need to make this happen? So in the case of gonadotropin releasing hormone, a lot of times when people say that they sync up their cycles, what they're doing is you're smelling someone else's estrogen or progesterone, depending on which part of their cycle they're in. That causes the GnRH release to be changed to time to be paired up with whoever it is whose hormones you're smelling. So that is an external signal causing the either release or delay of this hormone. This hormone then releases LH and FSH, which stimulate the ovary and testes, and we'll talk about that a lot more later. So basically, you don't have to memorize all of these because that's crazy town, but know that the hypothalamus takes in sensory information to release a releasing hormone, basically a precursor releasing hormone. The pituitary then is going to release a releasing hormone once it's stimulated that goes into the general bloodstream and goes to wherever it has receptive cells. So that's the big difference there. Let's see. Okay, so what about, that's basically all you really need to know. Let's go about this. Okay, so let's just look at the thyroid gland as an example of a typical steroid hormone, or typical endocrine gland. So again, this sits underneath the larynx. This is the anterior view, so you're looking from the front. All of this tissue basically is the same, similar cell types that either release T4 or T3. That's thyroxine and triiodothyronin. These are two hormones that have to have iodine to work. They kind of look a lot like steroids. They're not pure protein hormones. They're weirdo hormones, but what they do is they maintain your metabolism. So they maintain your metabolic rate, your blood pressure, your body heat. They deal with weight loss. You have to have iodine for this to work. So if you live near the ocean, there's a lot of iodine in the ocean, so you're taking in enough iodine that way. But people were realizing that people that don't live near the ocean they would get things like these thyroid hormone abnormalities, okay? And they were realizing, oh, these people, if they can't produce thyroid hormone, they get what's called cretinism in infants, where they just have, so they just don't grow very quickly, their heart rate isn't very good, they don't breathe very well. In order to treat it, you just inject them with thyroid hormone. Okay, so you have to have an active thyroid hormone that has enough iodine. So this is the reason why salt has iodine added to it. So table salt will say iodinized table salt, because they add iodine to make sure everyone gets enough so they don't have these kinds of issues. Kosher salt, on the other hand, never has iodine added to it. If you're just cooking with kosher salt, but you ever eat out in the world, you're still going to get enough iodine to be healthy. So that hypothyroidism is where you don't get enough thyroid hormone, but let's say you have too much. So if you have too much thyroid hormone, that's called hyperthyroidism, and that leads to something called Graves' disease. And that is, you get way too much metabolic activity. These are people who are really nervous. They can't handle heat changes. Their heart beats always really fast. you might say, oh, they have weight loss, that's awesome, except that not really, because what if you are underweight and then you're not maintaining your weight at all? It's actually can be really dangerous. And exophthalmia is where the pituitary gland has been stimulated so many times by how much, too much, there's way too much thyroid hormone in the blood. It goes and it is trying to tell the pituitary gland to turn off the thyroid, and the pituitary gland is getting bigger and bigger from multiple stimulations, and it pushes on the eyes, and you get this kind of bug eye effect. So that is that's exophthalmia. So this is the Harry Potter lady. Clearly, you can still survive and have an amazing career if you have this, but it's definitely something that should be treated if you once you notice it. The other thing that happens during hyperthyroidism is goiters, and so a goiter is where the thyroid gland gets larger and larger because it's being constantly stimulated, usually due to this lack of iodine. So the hormone is made, but it's not being released, and so it just kind of it fills up the thyroid, and it fills it and fills it, so you don't have a way to turn it off. And so how do you treat this? You have to go in and you can either remove the thyroid. It's actually dangerous because then you have to be really careful about regulating your thyroid hormone levels to make sure you're still going through regular metabolism phases. Or you can treat it with the right kind of thyroid hormone in the right doses. It gets complicated. But a goiter, this used to be really common in places before, like inland places before we iodinized our salt. So now this is not seen very often at all, except in third world or developing nations. We're not going to go into the adrenal cortex. It gets kind of complicated. So yeah, I think that's all we need to talk about hormones. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I'll leave you with this, and see you in class. Bye.